I'm going to start now because I have some announcements to make before I introduce our speaker. On Saturday, November 16th, the CCS Chinese documentary film series will present My Mother's Rhapsody, a 2011 film by director Qiu Jiongjiong, originally slated to be screened in the Yunfest Film Festival in Yunnan Province. The film is a journey into memory and visual metaphors as an 80-year-old mother displaced by urban renewal and her adult son reminisce on the past. On Monday evening, November 18th, the Center for Chinese Studies will present a CCS Chinese Independent Film Festival. There's going to be a lot of film in the next week at the Center for Chinese Studies. At the historic Michigan Theater, the evening will begin with a reception at 6 p.m. in the main lobby to meet Isa Cheng, coordinator of Yunfest, and two independent film directors, Cong Feng and Mao Chenyu. The reception will be followed by a 7 p.m. screening of Cong Feng's film Stratum 1, The Visitors, which is in Chinese, 地层一来客. The reception of the event is free and open to the public. On Tuesday, November 19th, the CCS Noon Lecture Series, which is this event, will present the three directors, Yi Cifeng, Cong Feng, and Mao Chenyu, who will be interviewed by Professor Marcus Nornes, the chair of Screen Arts and Culture Department. So we hope you're able to attend all those events. We would appreciate it if you could also take a moment to shut off your cell phone before we begin today. Today's presentation will be given by Nicholas Kalchina, Howson, hard C, professor of law at the University of Michigan Law School. Professor Howson has also taught at the Berkeley, Columbia, Cornell, and Harvard Law Schools. He earned his BA from Williams College and his JD from Columbia Law School, and spent many years living in the People's Republic of China, both as a scholar at Shanghai's Fudan University, Beijing University, and Chinese University of Politics and Law, as well as East China University of Politics and Law. And as a practicing lawyer based in Beijing, a former partner of the New York-based international law firm Paul Weiss, Rivkin, Wharton, and Garrison, and he worked out of the firm's New York, Paris, London, and Beijing offices, finally as managing partner of the firm's China practice based in the Chinese capital. Today he will be speaking on Quack corporate governance as traditional Chinese medicine, firm organization, and the consequences of China's unreconstructed political economy. Thank you, and please join me in welcoming him.
Whoops. Thank you, Mary. I've just been given a mic, which when I wander in a bit, you'll have to remind me to use. Thank you, Mary, for that wonderful introduction. I realize I'm working at some disadvantage in this venue because Mary can give a lecture on labor contract law in China and show slides of people with strange haircuts and how that determines their labor mobility. Emily can show us wonderful films of modern dance in Beijing and Shanghai. Wang Zheng gave us a wonderful lecture years ago, which was the covers of all the Fu-Nu, which was wonderful, but I don't have any of that. I'm actually dealing in an area which is far more boring and tedious, and I'll, in a minute, get to why that's so and try and make it not so for all of us. The genesis of this presentation is Mary and Ina contacted me more than a year ago, I think, and said, when you're back in Ann Arbor, we were away for a while, would you be willing to give a noon lecture at CCS? And I said, of course. And so she asked me for a topic and even a short abstract as to what I was going to talk about. And after giving that to Ina, I then wrote a paper. And remarkably, the paper that I wrote is sort of consistent with what I had said to Ina over the phone or over the email. And that paper was, because I'm a law professor, it's very big and boring. It was on the table, but they've all been taken away along with the grapes and the cookies. If you're interested in the paper, there's a link to SSRN on the bottom, correct, Ina, of the announcement for this talk. So you feel more than welcome to click on that, and you can actually download the paper that serves the background, serves as the background for this presentation. So what I'm going to try to do today, I'll give you a summary up front if I can, is reveal something about the design of a system of legal and regulatory norms in a specific sector in China. And that's something which I hope to reveal, will reveal in turn, I hope, aspects of China's true political economy, Second, the real development of China's so-called legal construction program, which foreigners always talk about legal reform, but I actually prefer the direct translation of the Chinese term in terms of by talking about legal construction. And third, and I hope most provocatively, I hope to reveal an aspect or an identity of the way in which a trope that we spin around a lot isn't perhaps true. And that trope is that in China in the reform era, we've seen a retreat of the state, and substituted for state involvement in almost every aspect of life is this idea of the legal system, legal reform, or the governance system under law. And the trope is that the retreat of the state and the imposition or the arrival of a legal system has in some way contributed to personal and political autonomy, freedom, and in some cases even justice. What I hope to show you is a circumstance whereby the re-involvement, the reinvestment by the state into a governance system is actually is quite benign and is actually required. Now, I thought I'd do, this is the major sin in any kind of presentation, which is to read a passage. It's a double sin to read a passage written by someone else. But I intend to do that right now, give you an excerpt from an article by Bill Alford and Shen Yuanyuan, who are both scholars of Chinese law, writing not about corporate law, which is what the purpose of the discussion is today, but instead writing about the marriage law and the genesis of the marriage law in China. And their take, or the possible dichotomy they see, is exactly what I'm trying to identify in a very separate world. And I'll just recite now from their article. Hopefully this will be resonant with this group. Law is increasingly seen in both academic and policy circles as critical to the attainment for Chinese of fuller economic, political, and social freedoms. In part, the prominence accorded to law is attributable to its perceived potential, however imperfectly realized to date in the People's Republic of China, to facilitate the above-described transfer of power from state to society by limiting the spheres of life over which the former, the state, has authority, and providing constraints as to the manner in which such authority is to be exercised. In contrast to the avowedly political and highly particularistic manner in which the Chinese state historically reached into citizens' lives, law is commended for being facilitative rather than determinative, providing a neutral framework through which citizens, each endowed with the same rights and each entitled to invoke the uniform procedural protection that formal adjudication is intended to provide, may work things out for themselves. Compelling though the rationales for a drastically circumscribed role for the Chinese state may be, they do not provide us with a sufficiently nuanced metric for thinking about freedom in the People's Republic of China. Without slighting the values to which this vision speaks, we need soberly to confront difficult questions regarding the ways in which even the most seemingly neutral rules intended to do no more than structure autonomous decision-making may shape outcomes and have an impact on freedom. And what they're not saying, what's implicit for me, is a negative impact on freedom. Now, as I say, that excerpt is from an article wondering, analyzing the process, the development of the marriage law, which is family law in China, which impacts upon perhaps the most personal circumstance, the most personal kind of relationship. What they're saying in their article is that there is perhaps room with respect to those kinds of transactions for the state to reassert itself, to get in the middle of autonomous relationships. Why? Because in China, as many of us know, there are some traditional aspects to marriage and the husband-wife relationship which are perhaps to be constrained, to be pushed back against. So their argument is that this is an area where we perhaps don't want the state to recede entirely. We want the state to jump in. What I'm going to talk about today, I think, is even more provocative, and it's not as immediately accessible as the idea that we want the state to help us protect women, say, in marriage. What I'm going to talk about is a situation whereby we want the state to come in and do battle with horizontally placed, superbly strong and robust political economic actors, which will be the controlling shareholders that I will describe in a moment. So whereas in one situation we have the state protecting women in marriage to give them rights that aren't feudal and medieval. In fact, in this situation, we're going to have the state. I think you're going to see the state working against the power of some of the strongest political economic actors in the empire, in the region. But before I do that, I want to discuss, I want to do a little bit of discussion and exposition on corporate law. Now, this is where your eyes are supposed to glaze over when you hear me invoke the glories of corporate law. But I think it's necessary because I will be able to use this transaction or this potential transaction to illustrate exactly what the mechanism is that I am celebrating today. Two things about corporate law. First of all nations, it seems, including China, have celebrated a movement of corporate law from something which is pertains to a business regulation model to something that we call an enabling model of law. What does that mean? In the olden days, in the 19th century, corporations could only be created by virtue of an act of legislation of the legislature. So imagine going to John Boehner. If you wanted to form a company, you'd have to go to John Boehner and say, can you get your Republican caucus to pass a law that allows me to have an internet company? Boy, that's a very significant constraint. We've moved far away from that across the world to law, which provides a standard form contract effectively for the creation of corporate entities. Think of your local internet success. And the idea behind the law as we see it now is that it is enabling. It's sort of a standard form contract for all the things you buy into when you stand up and say, I'd like to form a corporation. It's enabling because it provides a whole bunch of default rules which apply whatever you say, but you can obviously contract out of those default rules. That is perceived to be a very good mechanism because it allows people who want to contribute capital into companies to strike their own deal, right? And people have different interests. You know, Mark Zuckerberg has a very different interest from, say, Arnold Schwarzenegger in terms of investing in Facebook at inception. So the idea is that this enabling nature of corporate law allows us to aggregate capital and engage in good, benign capital formulation. Now, the contrast we want to make with this enabling model of corporate law is another equally boring area of law, which we lawyers call securities regulation. What is securities regulation? Well, that's the regulation or the law that applies to people who are engaged in issuing stock or trading stock. There, the law is not enabling at all. It's in fact mandatory. Why is it mandatory? Because we have to force people to disclose everything about their company before they sell stock to you and me. It's nothing they would choose to do unless you mandated it. So the orientation of these two areas of law, corporate law on one side, enabling, flexible, cut your own deal within a very wide latitude, to securities law, which is highly mandatory, focused. You can't do anything but what is commanded in the law. The second thing to say about corporations and the corporate law form, or the corporate form and corporate law, is that we celebrate generally the idea that corporations or firms, and this is in any jurisdiction, are highly adaptable. Why are they adaptable? Because of the default rules that apply in a corporation aid in terms of efficiency of decision making. I'll give you a good example. If you have a partnership, a normal common law structured partnership, before you make any decision, the owners of the partnership must, by a majority, vote to say, yep, that's a good idea, we should do that. And if they're doing anything, if the partnership wants to do anything out of the ordinary, you have to have unanimous consent at the partnership level. Now, we're all human beings, and we understand how sticky that would be to just make your purchase of Staples, and at Staples, of Staples at Staples. If you needed unanimity, anyone could hold up that transaction or that decision. That's not what happens at corporations. At corporations, we separate ownership and management, and we vest all of the management and decision-making power in these people called directors, right? And directors only make decisions according to majority rule. Therefore, the shareholders, the true owners of the firm, have nothing whatsoever to say about what kinds of decisions are made at the firm, and that in a great sense obviates all the hold-up power that some owner might say, well, I woke up this morning and I really don't want to buy Staples at Staples. I want to do something else. So that block is not apparent in the corporate world. Now, the other thing to say about corporations is that these directors are brought to the firm, are brought to the party by the shareholders. Therefore, if you have a majority of the shares, if you've got most of the shares, you get to elect most of the directors. Therefore, we say if you've got a majority of the shares of a company, you have control because you control through the board of directors. Now, what keeps the directors in line in a corporation? Why don't they just steal? Why don't they just engage in transactions with their spouses or whatever they want to do? Because we have this doctrinal thing called fiduciary duties. Directors are obligated to conform to fiduciary duties of care, loyalty, and good faith, which is another way of saying that they have to act honestly and in the interests of the corporation. So that's my minute discussion of corporate law, and trust me, this will become highly relevant as we shift our focus to China. So let me just talk, and Ina, you'll tell me if I'm singing like Sinatra. Can you hear me? Is this working? If I have to do something. I want to just describe very quickly a possible transaction, which you'll be glad to know, because this is the Center for Chinese Studies, is a transaction or a problem that we have identified long-term in China. I want you to posit that there is a company. It's a listed company, therefore it issues shares, and let's say it owns and operates automobile plants. It has a shareholding structure whereby there are a lot of us, people who buy shares on the public markets. We own 60% of the company, but there are lots of us, and we have sort of a collective action problem, right? There's no assurance that we'll all act together or with one mind. On the other side, there is a controlling shareholder. That's where you cue the music. Boo, controlling shareholder, right? Because this is going to be the oppressive character in our story. A controlling shareholder has only 40% of the company, but certainly controls the listed company by virtue of how diffuse these are in the collective action problem they have. Now, this structure will produce a board of directors who will work not formally, but in reality, in whose interest? The people who brought them to the party, the board of directors, okay? But, as I said a moment ago, these directors have what we call fiduciary duties. They are obligated under the law to be loyal to the company, to take due care, and to act in good faith. Okay, posit that this controlling shareholder has a 100% owned subsidiary, okay? And this subsidiary actually owns steel plants. It's connected to making automobiles, but it's not the same business. This company goes out to Gongshang whatever, any bank, JP Morgan Chase, and says, I need to borrow a lot of money to make more steel plants. So they take a loan, and they have, therefore, a repayment obligation, right? So forget about all this spaghetti. Just focus here. So this is a very understandable transaction. We've all borrowed money in life, and we have the obligation to repay it. Now, here's the problem, or here's the problem that we identify very quickly. Often that lender will say, who's going to guarantee that repayment obligation? Well, in the normal course, you could get a guarantee by having the steel plant, the hard assets, secured. This is like your home mortgage. But another sort of common way to think about it is, how about the 100% parent of the borrower saying, yep, I'll guarantee that repayment to the lender? That's a good way to think about it. That's not what we see, and it's not what we saw very often in China over the past several decades. What we see instead is this controlling shareholder causing this company to provide the guarantee of that borrower's repayment obligations, okay? Now, what I want you to see very briefly is how screwy that is, right? That is a party which really doesn't have a complete interest in making sure that that company is financed. In fact, it's an exploitation of these people. It's an exploitation because they have contributed money to run a certain kind of assets which throw off certain kinds of revenues. But the controlling shareholder is acting badly in forcing this listed company to stand behind the obligations of something which is a 100% subsidiary of the controlling shareholder. Now, in formal corporate law terms, this, what I've described, if the guarantee came from here, this would be a breach of corporate fiduciary duties, okay? And I'll just take that at face value. This would be a breach of their loyalty. You would have a claim in court to say, you directors, you acted not in the interests of our dear listed company, i.e. all the shareholders. You acted in the interest of a specific subset, the people who controlled you, like robots, right? So that's bad. So in the normal course, we'd have a claim against these people for a breach of corporate fiduciary duties. What I want you to note is the way I talked about this transaction and the remedy is all what we say in the corporate law is an ex post. It's something that happens afterwards. And what do you need if you're going to bring a claim to attack decision making that happened in the past? You need a court, right? And therefore you need a court that's quite, I don't know, intelligent, competent, independent, autonomous, can actually do that, can turn around and say, yep, you guys made a bad decision which was disloyal, therefore we're going to take you off to fiduciary duty prison. Okay, there is no fiduciary duty prison, I guarantee you. So let's park this idea for just a moment, and now let's get to China and the guts of the paper. And this hopefully will become relevant for you in a minute. In China, as in the rest of the world, we celebrate this movement towards an increasingly enabling corporate law. The 1994 company law was, of course, the first company law in Chinese, in post-liberation history, and it was amended wholesale in 2006. And the direction is very much from that sort of onerous, sticky, state-planned, kind of constraining business regulation idea to something which is far more enabling. At the same time, and this is really the thrust of some of the exposition in the paper, at the same time as we've seen that movement with respect to corporate law, we've seen a very sustained intervention by China's securities regulator, or its securities regulatory agency, imposing something completely different from enabling law, imposing instead mandatory regulation. And mandatory regulation, which does not necessarily just talk about what Chinese companies have to disclose into the public capital markets, but indeed how they have to arrange their most internal, most intimate corporate governance arrangements. Now, I'll just, as a tangent, because I'm speaking in the United States of America, this is perceived in America to be almost as bad as the original sin in the Garden of Eden. There are a number of academics, my colleagues at Michigan and elsewhere, who will throw up their hands and say, this is an outrage. Why do they say that? Well, in the U.S. context, we're all heavily invested in the idea of federalism. Corporate law is done at the state level. Federal law is securities law. Therefore, if there's any breach between that gap, people, start quoting Jefferson, Madison, et cetera. There's a more sophisticated critique of this development, which really comes from the law and economics field, which is the idea that we like the idea in America that all the states are coming up with new ideas in their state corporate law, and there will be survival of the fittest. The best corporate law, the best arrangements will rise to the fore, and therefore everyone will incorporate in, I don't know, Delaware. That's what they do already. But the idea is, the theoretical idea is that it's good to have competition, and once you federalize the law and you have this big, heavy incursion from the securities law side, that's a bad thing, and that's sort of un-American. Okay, let's say it's un-American. Now, the rest of the world is not un-American, happily. In fact, in Europe, certainly in China, as I'm discussing today, in Japan, you do see much more interaction between these two separate systems of law. But this is the origins of when Witt walked in, he said, I think you said quack, quack, or you have your ducks in a row. This is the origins of the title of the paper, which talks about quack corporate governance. The academics who have been criticizing this in America have called it quack corporate governance because, well, like all quack medicine, there it is. So in China, what's happened instead, as I say, is this very, very sustained intervention by the Securities Regulatory Authority, which many of you know as the China Securities Regulatory CSRC Commission. Sorry, but I'll talk about it as the CSRC. The breadth and the depth of the incursion by the CSRC, by the China Securities Regulator, into the province of corporate governance is simply stunning. Okay, it's stunning, surprising, and complete. And they've done it, as I describe in the paper, in three distinct ways. First of all, they've come up on their own with essential doctrines that are required for good corporate governance and imposed them into Chinese law. Second, they've created so-called self-enforcing rules, which I will describe in a moment, which actually restrain the behavior of people, of participants in the firm ex ante. And third, they've created or they've imposed institutional arrangements, which also lead to to good corporate governance. So I'll give you a number of examples, and there are many examples in the paper. First, an example of a substantive doctrine that the CSRC, remember this is the securities regulator, not the parliament, not the legislator. One of the things that they've imposed is fiduciary duties, which is in and of itself, which is a basic doctrine which you need to operate companies, to have corporate governance. The idea a minute ago where I said these directors have corporate fiduciary duties, those did not exist in law as passed by the National People's Congress in China. Instead, they were carried into Chinese law writ broadly by the securities regulator, okay? And that, for those of us who care about this, is kind of stunning. Now, second and much more importantly is the idea of imposing self-enforcing rules. And that's how I get back to this hypothetical transaction. I posited a moment ago that the approval by this board of directors of the guarantee that went from the listed company to the benefit of that borrower was bad and was a stain on their duty of loyalty. What about a rule that says that the board of directors cannot make that decision ex ante, beforehand? In fact, that kind of decision, if it has that architecture, can only be approved by all of the shareholders of the company, okay? That might be a significant block, but someone will put up their hands and say, Howson, you're incredibly stupid. I don't care about a shareholder's vote because the people who are behind this evil deed own 40% of the shares, and they can certainly ram it through the shareholders meeting in terms of approval. So how would we turn the ratchet a little bit and say, yes, you still need a shareholder's vote, the owner's vote at the company, but these people can't vote. And you have to get a majority of these people to approve this related party transaction, this tunneling transaction. That is precisely the kind of thing that the CSRC has done, has imposed a rule like that on Chinese companies, saying that in this kind of transaction, the board of directors, they're so polluted they can't make the decision. The shareholders meeting that would approve it as the owners has to have a vote to approve it, but you have to recuse or get rid of the controlling shareholder. So you have kind of a pure vote, right? This is thought of as a self-enforcing rule. Why is it self-enforcing? You don't need to wait for a court 6 years later to say, you guys made a corrupt decision. What happens is there's a block ex ante. It's in a sense self-enforcing. Now, if those shareholders decide, yep, even though it's a corrupt transaction or it's you're not serving our interest, we're fine with it, that's fine, it'll go ahead. But they certainly have an opportunity to block it, to really self-enforce the duties of loyalty that those directors should have brought to the party. And there are other examples that I give in the paper, but I'll stop there in terms of as a descriptive. The third idea that we understand from this kind of intervention by the securities regulator is the creation of institutions. And the prime example there in China is the idea of independent directors. The CSRC, as a securities regulator, has mandated that a number of the directors on the board, these characters, have to be independent. They can't be related to the controlling shareholder. They can't be married to them, blah, blah, blah. They have to be truly pure, truly make independent decisions. Now, there is a temperature taking which we have to do as we learn about these different styles or these different kinds of intervention. And I'll give you the temperature taking right now. There is the idea in China that if the CSRC says it, if Mao Zedong says it, doesn't matter. If you say that these directors have a fiduciary duty of care or loyalty, that's great, it's symbolically important, but it will go unenforced if the courts in China don't have the moxie, don't have the political independence, don't have the competence to enforce it ex post when all the dust has settled. And I agree with that, right? So we have to question what work the CSRC is really doing in terms of pulling out these very good doctrines out of thin air and imposing them into the lifeblood of corporate governance. However, what I call the self-enforcing rules are highly effective, okay? So I will grant you that the imposition of doctrines that are symbolically comforting is one thing and probably doesn't have much of a chance of success. The self-enforcing rules really work. Why do they work? I know they worked. I've been at those shareholders meetings. I've seen this controlling shareholder have to run off into a cupboard and not make a vote, right? And it's left in the hands of people who really have an interest in this, not in this system of companies. Now, The two important questions for me, and some of this Professor Ang, there she is, has helped me. I've shown her drafts of this paper, and she's come back with very good ideas on both fronts. But the important ideas for me are the following. First, why has this happened, right? Why has the CSRC taken up this this cudgel and done this? And the more interesting question, I think, for us as sort of amateur or professional political scientists is how? How have they dared to do this, to fight back in this way, as I say, very much in the internal spaces of corporate governments? Well, the why is easier for me as a legal analyst to understand, and I think it's deeply revealing of what China's political economy is today. Now, I'm going to say a lot of things which are highly generalizing, so please forgive me. You can pillory me in the Q&A. We all know that China, over the past several decades, has engaged in a process of not privatization, but really corporatization without privatization. What has that entailed? Well, really, the remaking of state-owned enterprises as corporations, as corporate entities, but without divesting the state or proxies for the state of control at those enterprises. Now, some of this is as simple as understanding the emperor's new clothes, right? You have an SOE at time one, you do a magic trick called legal identification, boom, you have a company which instead of being owned by all the people is suddenly owned by shareholders. It just so happens that the Ministry of Textile Industry, which used to run the SOE, is now the Shanghai Textile Holding Investment Company, which happens to own 80% of the shares of the same company. All you've done is created a new form, but control is still vested in the status quo anti-actor. So the deliverable here for you is that there has been corporatization, but not privatization. Control has not fundamentally shifted in China with respect to these companies. Therefore, we say when we look at corporate governance in China, we understand, first, that the issue in corporate governance is not vertical. Normally in corporate governance, the issue is whether or not shareholders can hold directors or decision makers accountable. The real question in Chinese corporate governance is horizontal. Excuse me. You're worried about some shareholders being exploited by their co-equals. You look across horizontally. So there is a controlling shareholder problem in China. Second, and this should be most resonant to you, is that these controlling shareholders are not normal controlling shareholders, right? This is not Rupert Murdoch. Well, maybe it is Rupert Murdoch. But Rupert Murdoch is Rupert, right? But he is not the former ministry of Rupert Murdoch or the former ministry of something, right? These people not only have very significant economic power and entity power by virtue of their 60 or 80% or 40%, they also have political power, right? We all understand who is behind the former ministries, who is behind, therefore, the controlling shareholders. And you can run the traps on this to see that these are riddled with executives and officers who are really nomenclatura appointments. They're not the person who does the best automobile plant in Dongbei, right? It's actually the person who was the deputy party secretary in Jilin, who's over there now suddenly the CEO of a car company. The problem is that given corporate law default norms and the way we set up corporations, there is nothing these situations could be but engaged in exploitation of minority shareholders. Everyone in China knows what's going on. Why do I say that? Because these people are asked to make a minority investment, right, say through the public capital markets, alongside a gorilla. The gorilla is the controlling shareholder, which has a very heavy, thick state political background. But the law says that whoever owns most of the shares gets to direct all the directors who get to direct the company to do whatever they want it to do. Everyone knows that up front, right? So this is a very significant problem because you can have corporatization, but if you don't have privatization, what you have is a situation whereby these minority investors, even if they are widely diffuse like this, will be openly exploited by the system. Now, this is all part of my explanation as to why the CSRC has ridden in on a white horse from stage right to save the day and to, in some sense, countermand the power of these people who I've now told you are very significant political plus economic actors. There's some other concerns which I think inform why the CSRC has done this. First, I think we have to have some very serious doubts about the lawmakers in China, and there I hope none of you are part of the National People's Congress, but let's be honest. The National People's Congress is not supine, but will make law in a way that is sometimes not only lacking in competence, we have that too in our Congress, but also lacking in independence. And there's a lot of good work trying to identify parts indeed of the company law whereby political influence has been brought to bear by what we now call CSAC, which is sort of the latest entity set up to hold all of these controlling shareholder interests. And the example I give in my paper is it's with respect to something called corporate veil piercing. Corporate veil piercing is a situation whereby a creditor looks at a company which has an obligation to the creditor and says, you know what, you say you have limited liability, but you have no money, and you're clearly controlled by someone else. I'd like to pierce that veil of liability and go up and sue your controlling shareholder. Well, when that clause was being drafted in the 2006 company law, CSAC, or those forces, wrote in and said, you can't have the more permissive standard that you want. In fact, it was suggested by the CSRC, which actually helps my argument, because that would stick to us as the guardian of all these controlling shareholders. So you had direct intervention from these people, political intervention at the legislative level. Obviously, if we have doubts about the legislature, both in terms of competence and independence, we have to have doubts about the courts and their ability to not get mucked around in all this stuff, but to apply the law ex post, afterwards, right? When I started on this transaction, on this hypothetical, I said, oh, one way we do it is we bring a lawsuit 2 years later and say, that decision was corrupt. That was a breach of your legal duty X or Y. But that presupposes that you have, first of all, an independent bar that will bring that case, and of course courts that can have the competence, autonomy, and independence to actually construe the case, get a good judgment, and attack who? These very powerful actors, right? Or even if they're the directors, they're the same characters, right? So a very difficult thing to understand. So what we say is, look, the CSRC is basically the only sort of competent agency left to impose this law, and that's why we have it. The more sort of provocative question is the idea of how in the world has the CSRC done this? Because what we're seeing here, I want to remind you, is the CSRC, which is a state agency, part of the same party state that these controlling shareholders are part of, acting directly against the interests of very significant party state actors. Now, I speculate, and Professor Ong has helped me speculate, and I hope and expect you will in the Q&A if it ever comes. No, it will come. I speculate in a couple of directions. One is an idea that I know from personal experience and from research that the CSRC thinks of itself in a funny way as a ministry, but a ministry of what? As a ministry of the capital markets, which sounds strange, like a ministry of stock exchanges, right? I invoked a minute ago the Ministry of Textile Industry, right? In old China, or not old China, but sort of pre-reform and reforming China, you would understand the Ministry of Textile Industry as being the guardian of all those textile plants in Shanghai, in Chongqing, you name it. The CSRC thinks of itself very much as the guardian of this new thing called the capital markets, which are the stock markets, debt and equity markets, and therefore thinks it's central to its mission to constrain some of the bad behavior here to make these kinds of investments, which come through the stock exchanges, more palatable, more, ex ante, the idea that there might be a leveler playing field. Second is the idea that this is yet another identity of what Ken Lieberthal and Mike Oxenberg in this very institution gave us as a fragmented authoritarianism. Now, when Ken and Mike Oxenberg talked about fragmented authoritarianism, I think they're mostly directed at sort of a vertical axis, right? Center versus local. I want to remind you that this particular tension is actually between one group of very significant party-state actors and another group of very significant party-state actors. It's much more horizontally oriented, and also the people who are being constrained or attacked are forces that are offered to us as commercial forces, as independent shareholder entities, right? Whereas everyone knows their political background. So this, to me, is a new identity of the fragmentation, and it's horizontal, and the subject of the fragmentation, at least on one side, is something which we've only seen in the new China, in the post-reform China, which is apparently commercial actors, capital-wielding entities, but acting as stuck very deeply into the political system. A couple of other ideas which I think are important to surface. One is that there are indications, and this is actually in many jurisdictions, not just in China, that these people actually want these constraints. Okay? Now you're going to scratch your head there and say, why would these people ever want to be constrained? The answer is that if they're not constrained or seem to be constrained, will these people ever invest in that kind of company? The answer is they might not. We just don't know. So there is actually some benefit to these people to say, oh yeah, our hands are tied with respect to those related party transactions. Now please invest in our dominated subsidiary. That should give you ex ante some comfort. So there's something going on there. The analogy that I write about in the paper is actually what India has done in exactly the same area. Indian corporate governance reform, including a Sarbanes-Oxley type statute that came before we had Sarbanes-Oxley, the energy for the reforms came precisely from these people in the Indian circumstance. Last couple of things, and then I will conclude. Some of you may look at this situation and say, I know what this is about, Howson. You've been totally tricked. This is all for appearances. This is all to make you, a foreigner, and your foreign investor buddies feel happy and secure in investment, right? You know, we've got stock markets, we've got courts, we've got lawyers, we've got directors that have fiduciary duties. Are you okay? Right now, please give me your money. That's an important view, it's an important response, but what I want to emphasize is that everything I've described today has only to do with the domestic corporate governance sphere, okay? None of this is necessarily or even ever applied to foreign investors, okay? So if there is some communication going on to investors, it is primarily to Chinese investors, to Chinese people and Chinese entities, okay? So that's important to me. Now, there might be some pushback in this crowd as to how naive I am or how symbolic this all is, but I believe that statement very deeply. So I'm going to turn off now and just conclude. And I'm going to skip through some of my presentation and some of the paper. But the picture I've tried to give you today is something which at first blush looks like the state withdrawing from a certain kind of activity, a very critical activity, right, which is corporate life, corporate operation, capital raising. Why do we say that? Hell, you've got corporatization. The state isn't present anymore. And anyways, they're only a 40% shareholder, okay? So everything's fine. So it looks like, pursuant to law and this new identity of corporate life, that the state's finally coming out of enterprise. What I think we recognize, and we don't have to be terribly sophisticated, is that that has actually concretized state oppression or the oppression or exploitation of very significant state-tied actors, or let's just call them very significant political actors in the Chinese circumstance. And therefore, that dynamic calls for a response from the only other player available, which is another state actor, which is a state agency. And so this kind of turns around the idea, what I started with as the trope, the idea that the state is withdrawing and that law, legal governance is going to replace and make everything a level playing field and hunky-dory. Here we have a very good situation whereby we see that the law has actually enabled what? Enabled investment decisions and arrangements? No. It's enabled oppression and exploitation in the way you talk about a drug addict being enabled, okay? It's a bad thing, and therefore you need these mandatory rules from a state agency to do battle with that overwhelming power. So I'll stop there, and I went way over time, so I apologize.